we're about ready. It's Thursday. I don't know. It's Thursday. It's another quarantine stream. Good afternoon, morning, and evening to everyone and everyone. Oh my goodness. I'm tired. It's just been a week. Sleep schedule's been kind of messed up. And I've been trying to right that a bit. So past couple of mornings I've been going to bed like 2 or 3, waking up at like 8:30. And so I feel interesting today. But I had some iced tea, no sugar. I forgot to do my jumping jacks that I told myself I would do right before we started, but here we are, Thursday, stream time. What's going on with you guys? Today, kind of continuing some of the conversations we've been having. I wanted to share yesterday. So, yesterday, 2 parts. Actually, was hanging out with my girlfriend, and we made a lemon meringue pie. I've never made pie before, period. And it was almost a disaster. And that's not an easy, I mean, I don't know. That's what people say who bake. It's not the easiest thing to pull off. It wasn't like a failure. So we used like a pre-made pie crust you get from the grocery store that's frozen. It was like super thin. We put the first one in, and you know how it says to like dock the crust with a fork? I was like, how deep do I go and how many holes do I put in? So I put a bunch of holes, but I didn't go all the way through the crust. So obviously it steamed and puffed up in the middle and then hardened. And I was like, oh shit, I don't know if it's going to work. And then like I tapped it. I was like, maybe I'll be able to push it back down because maybe it's only like par baked. So it'll still be somewhat flexible now. Cracked in the middle. And like at that point I was freaking out about custard. It went from water to glue in like a split second. A bunch of stuff that I've never like done before. I've only watched a bunch of videos. But we had a second crust, it worked out. The custard came together. The meringue had stiff peaks. And it looked good coming out of the oven. But it had weeped. And guessing it was one of 3 factors based on what the internet told me, is that either it's the humidity where you're at, the overbeating the egg whites, or your filling not being hot enough because it needs to steam immediately, or it needs to be hot when you set the meringue on top. Otherwise, it's going to steam in the oven. It's going to create this pool between the meringue and the filling, which is what happened to us. So the crust sogged out on the bottom, but it tasted good. Did that. Was out. We had a drive-through boba place nearby. Hit that up. A lot of sugar. Felt weird. Watched Parasite, both of us for the first time. That movie was a fucking trip. I was freaking out. She was making fun of me because I was freaking out. So I don't like horror movies. Um, it's not necessarily a horror movie, but it's very suspenseful. It's one of those I really like. I don't watch many movies, um, in general, but I do appreciate the movie going experience, and I like to like. For me, movies are exhausting. I don't know. I can sit here and watch YouTube all day, or shows or whatever, but a movie is just like you're just in this, there's this level of engagement for this extended period of time. And I'm someone who like if my expectations are set in a certain way where like I'm not gonna take something too seriously or whatever, that's one thing. But I pretty much can't watch a movie without being like really engaged with it and really thinking about what's happening on the screen at all times. So watching movies for me is like an ordeal. So that's why I don't watch too many. But I appreciate the cinema experience, like watching with other people in a room and you're just part of, and understanding that people behind the movies are thinking about it in that context of how you're going to take it away. So Parasite is very interesting. I tried to really make sure that I really wanted to really keep an eye on the composition and like the cinematography, not just the story, because I kind of had some sense of what the story was going to be because people were talking about it. Luckily, nothing was like spoiled for me, because a lot of the suspense is in not knowing what's going to happen. And it's one of those movies like I remember watching The King's Speech a few years back, and it's like I don't know. I feel like it's not a very like high stakes movie if I'm thinking back on it. But there's a certain amount of tension in the way that like you have these shots that are like real close up on characters and very lingering. I feel like it's like in music, like stasis and stillness and quietness. Can be very tension building, especially in movies where you're expecting something. Expecting something to happen. Parasite, I found we were listening. It was super noisy around us, but I mean, there's like not a lot of music. I wouldn't say there's a lot of lingering shots, but the way that was shot, just very like the architecture and everything, like that created all the composition. It was very like it had this very oppressive feeling. I could talk a lot about the movie, but it's a really effective like piece of cinema, and I don't know. I think the messaging is pretty. I feel like there are clear takeaways, but I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I would have to understand more about Korean filmmaking and director specifically, kind of get an eye for like his language, and maybe sort of understand more of like reference of everything. But I don't know, it was very like I don't know, evocative in a lot of different ways, and it did call to mind. I was thinking a lot about Sorry to Bother You as well, although both are kind of wild movies, but Sorry to Bother You is a little more like almost fantastical, and the narrative is way more like there's a lot more threads through it, but they have a very similar critique and thesis. I think is interesting. I think Parasite is definitely way more intense. I mean, I'll watch Sorry to Bother You in theaters, and it's like a comedy movie, but there wasn't a lot of laughing. It is kind of a dark movie, but it has its lighthearted moments. Parasite has its lighthearted moments. It's interesting, like there are parts of it that felt like watching like a soap opera, and then other parts felt like a horror movie. But it was like a weird. It's like we watch a show. I used to get this all the time. I watched a show, like a cartoon or whatever, and a character was about to do something really embarrassing, and I'd be like, I can't watch this shit. I can't watch. I have to look away. It was kind of like that feeling, except like more horrifying, So I mean, I see why it's such a talked about film. And it's certainly very relevant. I mean, I think Sorry to Bother You is there's a certain optimism and a certain uh, almost like a call to action, but Parasite is pretty bleak, at least from my reading. There's a lot I was thinking about, like the epilogue and like what that means. It almost felt like I was watching like an American movie, because I remember like in high school taking French class, and talking about the difference between like European movies and American movies. European movies, like a French movie, will end like where an American movie will end like halfway through, where just something happens and then suddenly the main character walks off, and then it's like, what the fuck just happened? Or American movie, like 40 the last 45 minutes, they hold your hand, they wrap up everything, and then blah blah blah, happily ever after. Um, Parasite was almost like, it almost had that sort of feeling with the epilogue, but like there was something about it where it's just like it was too surreal to like, you know, to be taken that way. And I also noticed like it was very like I noticed also in American movies, especially like big movies, it's like when they're trying to establish a setting, there'll be these like big drone shots, helicopter shots, like a cityscape from above, and like these sweeping vista type shots. That's how they establish their setting. But that's not necessarily how people experience. Like if you're like in New York, you're not flying over the city skyline. You're in, sandwiched between a bunch of buildings and skyscrapers, graffiti, steam coming out the sewers and shit. Parasite felt there was nothing. You were the perspective of the viewer. You're locked in. You're like the concrete that like surrounds you on all sides. It's like boxing you in, and it creates a very different experience. It's a lot more grounding, which I think is part of what made the tension so effective for me. It didn't take you out of the moment really at all. You were just like in there for every second. It's an exhausting movie to watch, honestly, but it was cool. It's a really great movie. But anyway, why don't we move on to the rest of the show? I mean, I could probably spend a whole video or stream or whatever talking about some of those thoughts. It'd probably be better for me. I like watching movies with friends and talking about everything afterwards. Haven't had that experience too much lately. Even though, like I said, I don't watch movies that often anyway. But let's go to the shout outs. So today's shout outs. So I mentioned Monday, just basically the sort of large scale disenfranchisement of the American voting population, basically due to the way this pandemic is being handled, but also because of like literally like shutting down polling locations and trying to inhibit people from voting by mail and things like that. However, there have been elections where turnout has been pretty high, and I want to shout out some of the results that came in from Tuesday. One, AOC winning her re-election handily, and that's one where I think I was looking at the numbers, and I think the turnout even before mail-ins were considered was in contest with her 2018 election. Shout outs to that. Shout outs to Jamal Bowman, also in New York, taking out a guy who was endorsed by Schumer, Pelosi, and Hillary, and who Bowman totally clowned on a televised like virtual debate. And big ups to him. That was great to see. I mentioned Booker's primary race in Kentucky, competing to go up against McConnell in the fall. It's looking like he's edging out his competitor. And I mean, that would be great. I mean, it's hard to imagine that McConnell would lose in the fall, but to have like an actual progressive, put him in the hot seat, it's good to put their feet to the fire a bit. And I would also, in that context, give a shout out to Shahid Buttar's race against Pelosi in the fall in San Francisco. That is, I think that's definitely going to be one to watch. And again, I say this as someone who, I say all the time about electoral politics, and speaking of sorry to bother you, I'm probably going to mention it a couple times during this stream, but like I was watching some interviews with Boots, and he was talking about some of the issues of focusing on electoralism and how it can sort of take the steam from movements. And I think the Bernie campaign is sort of an example of that, just because so many people were so worked up on it because it was such a huge opportunity, and now that opportunity is squandered, it's like there's no structure for us to move on from that, and so it's up to disparate groups of people to pick up the pieces, which doesn't necessarily leave us in a strong position. However, completely abandoning the electoral process is probably not strategically the best move either. So it's got to be a balance. But I mean, we'll keep an eye on things that we have some effect over, and understand that the fundamental struggle is over the economic side of things, not just the electoral side of things. I also want to shout out the actually, I had an article. Let me pull it up. I got a shot of my legs. Whoops. So I've seen like people saying like people say they're gonna try to sell the idea that when there's inevitable surge in coronavirus cases, which there have been, shout outs to LA County for having the most cases in the country, and California for having big spikes after opening. We phase 2 or 3 or some shit. Shout outs to us for ignoring the data because of the markets and haircuts and things like that. However, where's this article? Essentially, there hasn't been a huge spike in cases connected to the recent protests, largely because most people are wearing masks, and these are happening outside. People are worried about underreporting, about, just being Trump's thesis that if you test less people, then you'll have fewer coronavirus cases. But apparently there's been decent testing set up for those who've been protesting. But again, I'm sure there are people who are like, they don't want to in any way incriminate themselves, even though protesting is not illegal, but it's certainly treated that way. But they don't want to incriminate themselves. Has my thing been echoing the whole time? Hope not. They don't want to in any way connect themselves to the protests, so that might be keeping people at home from testing or whatever. But it seems to be that so far there's no conclusive evidence that there's a spike due to protests. So shouts out to people who are still out there, sitting on lawns in front of City Hall, tearing down statues and yelling at cops, and putting their bodies on the line and things like that. Shouts out to that. For this week's for today's fuck yous. This one took me a second to understand, but I mentioned a few Supreme Court rulings, opinions that came in last week, I believe. One regarding protections due to workplace protections based on your sexual orientation and your gender, specifically for trans people. And what was the other one? Oh, it was the DACA ruling. Yeah. Today we're saying fuck you, the Supreme Court, for ruling against immigration rights. Let me pull this up. Fuck. That was why I had that tweet up. Hold up. It was right. So essentially, so this was actually a case that the ACLU took up, that Supreme Court ruled against, essentially denying migrants rights to migrants, asylum seekers rights to judicial review. People saying it's effectively denying habeas corpus to migrants who come in here detained, not being able to have access to judicial review for their cases, and just sort of further weakening their rights, eroding their ability to make their cases and be safe, whether trying to come to this country, trying to seek asylum or what have you. So this is a hit. I'm not really sure. Trying to fully understand the precedent that they're trying to decide on, and fully understanding what the implications of this are. I'm sure that it simply makes it more difficult for people to be protected if they're not a citizen of this country, and those protections are certainly being eroded on many fronts. And this is just sort of another one. We're taking a hit. Does it mean that people are going to stop fighting for people's rights to live and exist in other places? I mean, the way we enforce borders, especially in the last couple decades, is just brutal and inhumane in so many ways. So on that front, that's a hit, but certainly that struggle will continue. And take the wins and the losses, understand how that changes the context of what we're doing, and we keep going. The other fuck you, I already kind of mentioned it, the big spikes in California. You got Orange County people refusing to wear masks, sending death threats to health officials because masks are tyranny. The failure of our government, our institutions to provide for people, protect people, and take decisive action to prevent death and suffering. And that's just sort of ongoing, but just mentioning that this week, we got some extra bad news. Now, for the topic of the day, Wreckoning of Everything. This is sort of just a continuation of things that I've been talking about sort of what is the substantive analysis of the sort of current conversation regarding like Black Lives Matter and things like that. God, I need to have like a, I don't know. Anyway, you guys know every show I have to peek around my laptop to look at my notes. But anyway, it's what I got. Let's see. So I don't know. I have a few things swirling around in my head regarding this, and I wanna read a few excerpts from a specific article in a second, but I kind of want to lay the foundations first of kind of what I'm talking about. The Reckoning, I had the picture of the Columbus statue being teared down. I'm kind of just thinking about like, we got people tearing down statues, people getting canceled and stuff like that. I was kind of just thinking about it because like, this is a really multifaceted and multi-leveled sort of reckoning moment. Now, a lot of these things are a little bit more structural than others. I mean, most of these things are pretty surface, uh, some of these things are pretty consequential, especially on the micro level. I noticed like on Twitter, a lot of people calling out, abusers and things like that in their industries, trying to root out predatory behavior. I think, to me, I mean, that's great. It is awful that there are people in these industries that take advantage of their positions, as gatekeepers of their industry. I think it's a reflection of a lot of the other things we're talking about. And in a way, I think removing people from those positions, it is more of it does more to change the conditions than tearing down statues. But it's sort of, there's a connection there. There's a connection between that and these companies paying lip service to Black Lives Matter, say I'm going to donate this and that. Disneyland saying, "Oh, we're going to get rid of some of the racist stuff at our park. Finally, we're just going to take this opportunity." All these companies trying to get ahead of the narrative and being like, "Oh shit, Aunt Jemima's canceled, so and so is canceled, so we got to get ahead of the game. We got to find all our problematic shit and get it out of here so that no one comes knocking on our doorstep trying to cancel us, making us lose money for a short period of time because these brands are too powerful, and there's no way. You're not going to deplatform Disney." Unfortunately, these tactics do not work on institutions and those who, and actually a lot of the stuff that I'm thinking about actually kind of relates to some of the stuff I was mentioning. Parasite at the top kind of relates to some of the stuff I was thinking about with that movie, but I don't know. I don't want to spoil it. I feel like maybe I'll do, like, if I want to talk about it, I'll do like a dedicated show just in case, so I can talk about it, talk about what happens, and if you don't want to hear it, you don't have to. But there's something. It's we understand what the problems being addressed are, and we're trying to uproot things. But it's really it's just cutting a few of the blemishes off, right? I mean, there's something empowering about taking control of the space you're in, whether that be your industry and trying to root out abusers, or your little environment, like the city you live in. You got slave masters, immortalized in bronze and stone and stuff like that, surrounding you. Talk about oppressive architecture, you know what I mean? Like, there's something empowering about taking it into your own hands to remove that. But it is sort of removing a blemish. And so what does that mean for us? What does that mean for what we do with that? I think, having laid that out, let me go to that article that I was mentioning. So I have an article here. Cedric Johnson, professor, writing in Jacobin. When did this article come out? Like a couple days ago, a few weeks ago. Hold up. Yeah, like yesterday. Cedric Johnson and Jacobin, don't let blackwashing save the investor class. Sort of talking about a lot of stuff that I've been trying to speak on these streams lately. Sort of the vulnerability of Black Lives Matter in terms of being co-opted and manipulated to sort of get the heat off the backs of these companies, kind of like I mentioned, like like a company like changing their colors on Twitter to the Pride colors during June and not really doing anything else substantial, it's like it's pretty easy for these companies to pay lip service to the movement without really, committing to anything. I mean, they could commit their dollars, but it's, even $1 million, $100 million is a pretty small part of their capital. And it's similar to philanthropy, where it's really just it's a way to further seat their influence. But let me go to the words of Cedric Johnson and read from a couple of these paragraphs. So, let's see. While Amazon temporarily banned law enforcement usage of its facial recognition software, few of these responses are addressed to the direct complicity of corporations in policing, either as contractors with police departments or beneficiaries of policing regimes. Part of this is a consequence of prevailing understandings of the problem of policing, which focus on racial disparity rather than the more fundamental role that carceral power plays in reproducing the social order and political economy. Once we get past the militancy and millennial cultural aspects, the Black Lives Matter slogan is at heart a reassertion of civil rights liberalism and a basic plea for equal protection before the law. Essentially not necessarily an evolution of the conversation in the 60s, but just a recapitulation. Anyway, continues, with the interventions of capitalists, we have witnessed an intensive campaign of blackwashing, akin to greenwashing, that is, the adoption of the slogans, mantras, and ethics of racial liberalism in the ways that do not threaten fundamental commitments to exploitation. These forms of anti-racism are simply about firms trying to expand their market share through expressions of care and concern. Perhaps most important, the corporate embrace of Black Lives Matter has deflected public attention away from the roiling labor protests of essential workers, many of them black, against these same companies during the shelter-in-place orders. He goes on to talk about these past few months of labor activism, strikes, walkouts of people in these essential sectors, factory fulfillment, delivery drivers, restaurant workers, etc., and how they've been sort of brushed to the side by these companies who are so committed to high morality during this time, and he's sort of just speaking to again sort of what I've been trying to articulate in these streams about trying to make the class element, the labor element in this whole thing invisible, because policing is a reflection of disparities along the lines of race, but is also a massive reflection of disparities along the lines of class, because policing and poverty are hand in hand in our communities in America. And police, he used an example of this wealthy black businessman who's speaking to sort of the empathizing with the black experience, but if you're worth like 7-8 figures, the black experience is going to be very different for you than it is for someone who's living in historically impoverished, segregated, city in America. He concludes his article. I wanted to read these last couple paragraphs as well. Talking about the current protest specifically, George Floyd's unjust, again quoting from Cedric Johnson, George Floyd's unjust death provoked millions to take to the streets, and his life should provoke us as well to think seriously about the inequality and precariousness that have intensified amid the global pandemic. He migrated from Houston's 3rd Ward to the Twin Cities in 2014 through a church ministry designed to give men struggling with addiction a fresh start and employment. He found work as a truck driver and security guard. Like millions of Americans, Floyd lost his job when the restaurant where he worked as a bouncer closed down, and in April, he was diagnosed with COVID-19. His alleged use of counterfeit money reflects the criminally inadequate provision of income support. His death has become a powerful global symbol of racist policing, but his life was also typical of the plight of millions of Americans struggling to survive in a low-wage economy. No amount of corporate blackwashing, public therapy, monument remediation, or entrepreneurship will change the conditions he experienced, and millions more still endure. We need to build a political movement to abolish the economic insecurity and inequality the investor class requires, and we need to build a political movement to abolish the economic insecurity and inequality the investor class requires and wants the police to uphold. And again, this I get this. If I were to try to sort of synthesize some of these points and try to relate it to things that I've been talking about, what I mentioned on here is what I call a relationship to power, changing a relationship to power, because he talked about the statues and stuff like that, and there's something empowering about that, but similar to companies changing their logos to a black power fist and saying Black Lives Matter, and tearing down statues and outing abusers and things like that. Some of those things are going to have effects, real effects on their communities, but it doesn't change anything about the hierarchy. You can tear down the statue of a 250-year-old slave master, but it doesn't change who's in power right now. I have this line from listening to the new RTJ album, and I have some thoughts about the music of Run the Jewels versus the sort of politics of the Mike and LP, which might be an interesting discussion, but I don't know. But the line from the song with Pharrell and Zach De La Roca, look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Like literally every single piece of currency you have, those people own people, and the fact that it's still there, like, what has more power over your life? Is it an oppressive, like, symbolic figure? And again, I mentioned abusers and statues, and sort of like I'm trying to relate in my mind, sort of like the material meaning of some of these things. But I'm not obviously, someone who's abusive in an industry does way more harm in people's lives, and them having power taken away from them and them facing accountability is certainly there's real recourse for people in that situation. But what I mean when I compare these things is that you tear down the statue of the slave master, but the slave master is still running your life, the ones on those dollar bills. Because you're still locked into the financial system that was built by slavery and continues with low wage and essentially slave labor here and around the world. And that's what I mean about relationship to power. You're not changing your relationship to power when you cancel somebody or tear down a statue. You're using something that you have some control over, because that's sort of without a sustained movement of millions of people, that's sort of the prescription as we see it. And that's not to blame anybody. That's not to blame anybody. That's not to be like, you know, if you're out there on the streets yelling, screaming, tearing down statues or whatever, throwing out toxic people, abusers, I'm not going to say you're not doing anything, but it's similar to kind of what I mentioned before about putting all your energy into one thing, into like electoralism, is that you have to understand where the most gains are going to be got. And I think people might even understand. Again, I'll go back to something that Boots was talking about in another interview, where the interviewer was saying something about like some horrible practice that Amazon was doing, and he was telling me, like, in my head I'm thinking like, yeah, that's terrible, but what can I do about it? Like, and talking about people, when they hear terrible things and they think like, well, what can I do? Well, what power do I have over the situation? And then they just kind of put it to the side. It's not necessarily a sense of apathy. It's just a lack of direction. Because I think people understand that there are fundamental injustices that our society are built on. I think, there's been this growing support for this sort of anti-racism narrative. And I think there's something more broad about people's understanding of what's actually going on, which is being helped by the disastrous way that this pandemic is being handled, and how it's exposing how vulnerable all of us are, and how much the system lacks in terms of its ability to take care of the people who, exist in it. But where's the prescription? And that's part of why, like, I understand the going out in the streets and donating and things like that, something that we can actually do, something we have some amount of control over, and something that actually contributes. That's why I feel like I have to caution about feeling like, the job is done, and like the Twitter way of doing it is like, people stop posting about it, so you got to keep posting. Hey, if you stop posting, I'm going to guilt you into continuing to post, because that's all we got. All we can do is post and cancel people and try to start a hashtag and stuff like that, because we don't have structure, we don't have direction, and that is the shortcoming of it. But that doesn't have to be like, the fatal flaw. I mean, it certainly could be. But that doesn't mean we have to throw our hands up and say, it's just not going to work. But that's something to recognize. And fundamentally, I mean, the prescription is to have a class understanding and a class analysis, and to understand that the solution is exercising democratic will over the economic sector. I mean, we have a barely functioning democracy in terms of the electoral sector. And if you listen to Richard Wolff talk about this kind of stuff, he's great at like sort of the ABCs of critiques of capitalism. Very, very clear, very simple way of putting it. It's like Marx for kids or whatever, but understanding, we have this sense of democracy in terms of, you can vote. If you don't like someone in office, you can get together and you can cast a vote, and it's counted the same as everyone else's. Although somewhat similar to economics, there's almost a certain level of idealism with even that. Or economics is all about sort of the viewing everything as like this viewing like the most ideal scenarios of these things, and our way of viewing politics is almost the same. Like, everyone, one vote, one person, yeah, but so many different people are disenfranchised in different ways in our system. that even that's not like, you know, that's not without its setbacks and its flaws. Um, but he points out that, and then pointing out, why don't we have any democracy in the workplace, and what would that look like, and what does that mean? And thinking about like why do leftists, Marxists, socialists, whatever, why do they care so much about workers? Why do they care so much about labor movements and stuff like that? Why do they care so much about class? Is not necessarily a moral stance, even though the views are grounded in morality, but the analysis is grounded in history and patterns and systems. I mean, we understand the connection between race, poverty, and class, and economic side, the economic development of our country, because only black people were slaves. We had indentured servants coming over from Europe, but the distinction, because, those two groups often, there was a sense of solidarity between them because they recognized each other as a sort of underclass and a shared experience as an underclass. But laws were written to differentiate the two groups and to make enslaved African people lower than, European servants. And back then, our concepts of whiteness were different. If you're like Irish or Italian or whatever, you're not white in the same way that an Anglo-Saxon person is, and there are, distinctions between like different religions and different denominations and stuff like that as well. But I mean, that stuff was codified into law, racism codified into law, in order to keep underclasses from banding together, understanding that their shared their shared experience in terms of subjugation, and their control over the economic system. I mean, that is what has built the prosperity of this country. Free labor, slavery. If we didn't have that, where would we be? That's what it is. It's the understanding that the economic side of things has grown so powerful and so out of control in terms of what influence the people have over it, because all we can do is do symbolic stuff and cancel people and try to boycott stuff, even though, most of the time won't really make a big difference because you might win these small victories, but you're not going to change the power that these institutions have over your life unless you try to take control over the economic system in the way that only workers can, because workers are the ones that make it work, right? When I mentioned the other week about the longshoremen shutting down a whole coast of ports, trillions of dollars in commerce that they can have a stranglehold over. CEO is not going to move all that cargo, all that capital, just because they own it. They control it in the sense that they tell other people what to do with it, but they don't do anything. It's the workers who create it, distribute it, so on and so forth, that make everything run smoothly. And that's sort of what I talked about on Monday in terms of like what we call essential workers. They're essential in the sense that they're essential to things running smoothly and not falling apart. But they're seen as worthless. They're treated as worthless systematically by the fact that, we're not giving all essential workers, we're not covering their health care completely. We're not covering their needs completely. We're not trying to keep them safe. Still paying them minimum wage. These people are not essential. They're disposable in the sense of how they're treated by our governments and our economic system. But I mean, it's a very harrowing prospect, right? Because there's something about, I think I mentioned this on another stream. There's something about engaging with things in a way that you're encouraged to do. Social media encourages us to make a big hashtag, have a big discussion around a thing, try and get heat on somebody, trying to drag somebody, cancel somebody. It's easier to withhold your money from something you don't need, some consumer good that has nothing to do with your livelihood, because you don't support a company. Like I was talking to my girlfriend about Chick-fil-A. How can anyone go to Chick-fil-A when they spend so much money on, they're basically shoveling all your money into trying to take rights away from LGBTQ people. Maybe you should buy Ben and Jerry's instead. But I mean, like, what's that going to do? You can get rid of a Chick-fil-A and you could bolster up a Ben and Jerry's. But it's still the fact that, these companies are massive. They control massive amounts of resources. And it doesn't matter what the brand looks like and what the CEOs, how their personal morals are, because they're still operating under the same exact system. They've got factories around the world, and there's blood on. I mean, I don't care what company it is. I don't care what they make. They can make the most innocuous stuff, like ice cream or whatever. There's still blood on somebody's hands in some part of the process. I know, what was it? At Respectable Lawyer, I think, on Twitter was kind of like, name me a company, I'll name you, some sort of human rights violation that their product relies on. I don't know. A lot of it was like palm oil and stuff like that. I think. And Ben and Jerry's was hit up in that too. Although maybe they might have changed some of the sourcing, but I mean, like, still, you could try to suffocate out the bad parts of it. Be like, oh, these guys use slave labor, so we'll pressure them to stop using slave labor here. And they'll just try to squeeze pennies somewhere else. But anyway, the point I was trying to make. It is easier to engage on the terms, in terms of like our existence as consumers, interacting with the world as a consumer, and that's the only way of interfacing with the world. Having no real autonomy outside of, put my dollars here, I say this and that on social media, I argue with my family about this and that. Highly individualized and essentially wholly ineffective at confronting entrenched power. And even though it might seem daring in a lot of cases, people to speak out in certain ways, and people getting educated and people having conversations is certainly important. I think people being educated is kind of the first step, honestly. Not that everyone has to fucking read all these books and stuff, but I think if you have the luxury of sitting around and talking about these things, like, you got to be reading. You can't get away from it. You have to read something. You have to learn something. You have to learn something about history, and you have to absorb some of these analyses and some of these arguments. You have to have some understanding of what's going on around you. not everyone has to be on the same exact page in terms of, oh, I read so and so and this and that, but it's very enlightening. And I think, it's important to combine that with people's understanding of their own lives and their own environment, and their ability to exert collective influence. Because, I always say, you don't get much with the individual. Personally, on a sort of metaphysical or spiritual or whatever level, personal growth is important, and continuing to educate yourself and try to become more connected with other people and yourself, and be honest with all those things, and understand your own history and things like that. That's certainly a noble and I think a necessary pursuit. But if we're talking about strategically, how do we get it so that police in this country are not just a violent oppressor? How do we get away from black and brown people being so and so more times likely to be punished by the system for the same things as, white people and East Asian people, immigrants, citizens? I don't know. I don't know why I said that. I'm thinking about 5 different things. Yeah. How do we change that? How do we confront poverty and these vastly unequal outcomes among different groups? And unfortunately, it is more than just saying racism is bad and reading a book about how white people are afraid of their own guilt or whatever. And unfortunately, there needs to be more. Yes, people need to reflect, and communities need to have conversations. But I don't know. There's just been this weird stratification of these different groups in these conversations around these protests and Black Lives Matter. I think it's important people understand the context with which they go throughout life, based on the color of their skin or their family's history. But can't be squabbling and trying to delegitimize people because the color of their skin or the history of their family, when we're trying to figure out how to navigate this current opportunity, and trying to demonstrate in the name of anti-racism. And again, that's where the class part comes in, because these different I don't know, factors or modes by which we are oppressed in different ways through the state or different institutions, or with housing or with jobs and stuff like that. Yes, it does affect people from different communities in different ways, and different communities have their own specific needs to be addressed. But getting overly woke and sort of academic about it, when we really need is the largest movement possible, it can be very counterproductive. But again, it's the thing about, where do we feel we have the control? We have these groups of people talking online, and it's people who we mostly agree with. And if we don't like the way someone is doing something or the way they talk, throw them out. Because we have some amount of control over our own spaces, and it's easy. Social media provides us with a platform to do those things. But what does that do with Jeff Bezos? What does that do to you know, Apple or whatever, Elon Musk or Donald Trump for that matter, you know? So, I mean, the prescription is, you know, it's easier said than done, but we have a prescription. And I'm not saying, you know, there's nothing for the more cultural side of it. I do think it's interesting how the sort of culture war that has been brewing the past, you know, pretty much since Obama was elected, since Republicans became, they found like a sort of new racism in America, you know, in response to Obama's election. But the sort of culture war that's been brewing since then, I guess since Bush, I mean, I don't know, it's probably been happening for a while now, but I mean, not that it has never had any real world effects, but I mean, it seems it's spilling out in a current way that is interesting, you know. Now people are really like, you know, they're putting their bodies on the line for the culture war in terms of, you know, liberals who normally only post or share stuff on Facebook or whatever, actually going out to protest and exposing themselves to possible virus or possible police brutality, to the you know, MAGA, you know, MAGA freaks who you know, go in mass gatherings and refuse to wear masks because viruses are a cultural statement. So that, you know, that's kind of interesting. But to get at the root of all these issues, the prescription is clear. It needs to be, you know, we had, you know, all these different strikes and demonstrations from organized workers these past few months. And these workers who are essential to the function of our economic system. And that is the prescription. I mean, it's harder. It takes longer. It takes more coordination. It takes more focus than all these other things I mentioned. But that is the prescription. Real, organized, militant worker action. Because these are the people who actually control the levers of the economy. They don't decide where things go, which warehouses are bought where, how the money is spent, you know, the blood that's spilled because, you know, that's what makes everything run. But they're driving the trucks, they're unloading the crates, working at the factory, so on and so forth. That makes it all work. Because luckily for us, it's not all automated yet. And it's still very vital. Because money is meaningless. We understand that. Money means nothing. It literally means nothing. It is a representation of something that can be obtained with, you know, it's like a promise of something. So someone who has billions and billions of dollars, but no one who's willing to do what they say, to get a small fucking microscopic piece of what they have literally nothing. I mean, that's why they want to hide away in these fucking bunkers and these huge castles, and that's why they want to go to space. They understand this. They're not stupid. That's why they come out ahead of these cultural things. That's why they post Black Lives Matter online. That's why they say they're going to donate money. That's why they're trying to get rid of the racist blemishes in their past and in their structure, put black faces in high places and so on. Because they're trying to get ahead of it. Because they understand what their vulnerabilities are. That's like fucking oil and gas moguls and people who pay people to say that global warming isn't real, but they have their fucking global warming bunkers and shit. Whether they believe the science or not, they have the means to protect themselves. And they understand that when it all goes down, it's not the money that's going to matter, but it's the fact that they, they're building the institutions to ensure their longevity. The longer we let that propagate and develop, the more entrenched they will be. At the same time, the worse our conditions will get, which makes it more likely that we're going to do these kind of drastic things that are necessary to be done. But anyway, the point is that for all the money in the world, like, if there's no one willing to do those things for that money, if that's not the motivation, then none of what they're demanding be done in order to increase their wealth and to further entrench their power, none of that's going to get done. That's the prescription. We're tearing up, so many different things, trying to get at, these representatives of oppression, statues, getting, problematic people and abusers out of power, trying to diversify, board of directors and things like that. If you don't change any of these hierarchies, you don't address any of these things, you just have the same exact inequalities playing out. They just look different. Like the tweet about the prison camps, hire more women guards, Or I was watching this lecture with Angela Davis, and she was talking about sort of like glass ceiling feminism. Why are we so worried about the person at the top who gets to break through the glass ceiling? You should be more worried about bringing everyone up from the bottom and taking these hierarchies out. Just because one person makes it to the top, doesn't matter what their color is or their gender or whatever, that hasn't challenged power at all. Because we can see we got plenty of wealthy black people, women, gay, whatever, The hierarchies are still there, and they still play out in these racially unequal ways. So what does it do to have a rainbow coalition of billionaires when you still have billionaires, right? So that's what we got to be wrecking. I mean, shit, If this is just a small taste of what's to come, if this is just sort of the beginnings, because I don't know, I don't see our material conditions getting better. Even if Biden wins in the fall, which he probably will, with how poorly Trump is going to be looking at the end of this, unless he decides to fully turn around and be like, all right, we're paying everyone to stay home, we're going to do this right, we're going to pay reparations, we're going to do all this other stuff. Unless he just comes around and just does things that actually help people, and I don't know, maybe at this point it's too late. Maybe he looks really bad. He looks too bad already. I don't know. Maybe they'll get to the point where it's not going to get any better, and all these empty promises are just empty promises, and all the small victories don't do enough. And so we're out there again, and we have, reflected on what has worked and what hasn't worked. And that's the danger of these things that I mentioned, like these more surface level symbolic things that don't necessarily change our relationship to power. That the danger of them is that it's not like they don't do anything. They do something, and in some ways we're contributing. But if we just, dust our hands off and call it a day after that, then we're fucked. Because it needs to be a lot more than that. And thinking about the specific ways I, as an individual, can really get in there and do those things that I'm talking about. Like, yeah, that's part of the difficulty in the work that needs to be done. I'm a musician. If I stop making music, if every musician stopped making music, I mean, I'm sure they'll figure it out. But there are other things we can do, and I want to figure that out. I've been trying to think about that for the last few years. But really, like, that's where it is. That's where the power is, in terms of regular people, working people. Social media seems like the great equalizer. It's like voting. One person, one vote, one person, one tweet. And you can call a politician or a celebrity a dumbass, and they can read it. But they still have something that you don't. And all those structures that grind you down, they still exist. So the power that we have is the fact that we are we. More of us. And we're still essential to the way that things function. So always keep that in mind. I think that's about, yeah. I think that'll about do it. So, yeah, we're seeing things open back up. We're seeing continued. We're seeing spikes in cases. And asshole politicians are having to eat their words about how dangerous this stuff actually is. And foolish people going to the beach and going to bars and not wearing masks are bringing those consequences home and to other people around them. So 4th of July is coming up next week. Don't fucking go out. Like, not even just don't go out. Not even like go out but wear a mask. Do not go out. It's going to be really bad. It's going to be really fucking bad. Don't go to the beach. Don't go to the bars. Don't party. Don't hang out with anybody. Let it chill for a few weeks. If you're going to go do anything, wear a mask, please. Because in these situations, like I said, we don't have institutional support. The most we can do in the immediate is, in terms of individual action, is to just take these small steps to be responsible for ourselves, because we don't have that institutional support. But again, it's all about that long term. Building coalitions, organizing, speaking with people in your industry, in your workplace. Start small, see where everyone's at. Because you can't go from like, hey, yeah, you feel kind of weird about your boss, right? You feel weird kind of about your work. You feel like you're being ripped off, right? All right, let's go on strike right now. What? What if I lose my job? It takes work. It takes groups of people. Some charismatic leaders here and there, sure, but it's the plurality of people. So stay safe, and try and take it easy as you can. And we should be back on again, continuing next week, Monday. Same time, same place.